Welcome to Council Preview. I'm your host, David Ballerstein, Communications Specialist with the City of Marshfield. And as always, we have City Administrator Steve Barg here with us today. Welcome, Steve.
David, it's great to be with you today.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the council preview coming up. There's been a lot of stuff going on, just not regular council meetings, but budget council meetings on top of it. So as always, the meeting starts off with the roll call, pledge allegiance. We did have a few people in the comment period last time speak on the behalf of some of the budget items and stuff like that. Was there any changes in the approval of minutes from the November 8th regular meeting, budget meeting, and then the November 10th budget meeting?
Not that I'm aware of, David. And going back to those comments that you're referring to, those were taken to heart by the council on November 10th. They did come up with a tentative budget that's going to the the November 30th budget public hearing. And we invite people who want to weigh in to come to that meeting on Wednesday, November 30th at 6 p.m. That's when they'll consider the final budget.
Sure. And so the next thing after that, we got staff updates. You're going to be giving a presentation on the city's ethics board. Do we currently have one, and what does that mean for the city of Marshfield?
Well, David, we set up an ethics board about 2 years ago, I think, and the idea is twofold. First of all, if someone does something, let's say it's a council member or somebody else that seems like they might have crossed an ethical line, these people who are trained get together and they determine whether or not it's something that needs to be moved to another level. In other words, is it something that is serious enough to warrant other action? And they'll have a hearing, actually. The other thing is just to put your finger in the wind. Let's say Steve Barg is thinking about doing something. It's like, wait a minute, now, if this gets passed and I recommend it, my brother-in-law is getting money for this. He's the contractor who stands to benefit. I can go to that board and say, look, could you look at this? Because I want to know whether or not I should shy away from this. And it's really not usually Steve Barg kind of thing. It's usually the people who are voting. It's the council members, the committee members, to make sure that they're not voting for something that they personally would get money in their pocket from. And then they get a sort of a preliminary read from the board as to whether or not they ought to stay away or whether or not it's not really a big problem depending upon the circumstances. Right.
So it's pretty much like a check and balance to make sure that everything's done right. And it also probably goes along if, there's some of the meetings they'll ask if there's anybody that has conflicts of interest. That would fall into the same line of the ethics policy.
That is absolutely correct. And I think one of the reasons why a council member requested that this be put on the agenda for an update is they haven't met for a while. And they're probably wondering, does this board still exist? I haven't seen an agenda. They haven't met in a long time because they haven't had any requests. But they probably should get together soon, and I'll tell the council that, to have an annual meeting and just say, look, you guys are all interested in continuing to serve. Do we need any updates on training of your job? It's just been really quiet lately.
Right. All right. So next up on there, we got a mayor's comment period, and there's an employee recognition. And you want to speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, we'd like to recognize employees when they hit certain milestones, David. In fact, we had a great evening the other night of recognizing employees who hit 5, 10, 15, 20. Well, in this case, Pete Fleddy, who's now our fire chief, became our fire chief earlier this year, has hit the 25-year mark. He's worked for us for a quarter of a century. We want to recognize him. Pete is just a stellar person, and great to have him with us for 25 years.
Yeah, and we hope that he's here much more longer there, because it's really nice to have someone that's, how should I say, that's always present and a familiar face in the community, especially in public service.
Yeah, he's a highly dedicated professional, David, and I can't say enough great things. We have so many good people here, as you know, but he does a great job as fire chief.
Sure. Okay, so I don't think we're going to have any too much on the reports from the commissions, boards, and committees. On the consent agenda, do we have any changes that are coming up on here? There's actually quite a few of them here. So.
Yeah, maybe could I touch on a few of the items? And again, consent agenda, for those people who haven't followed us before, who are newer to this program, it's an opportunity for the council to approve with one motion a whole lot of things. Typically meeting minutes. In other words, all the committees and boards, they ratify their decisions through this. And then we call out certain ones, typically from the Finance, Budget, and Personnel Committee and the Board of Public Works, the two main council subcommittees, that really they may want to weigh in on. I mean, they may be resolutions, or they may be policies, they may be expenditures of large amounts of money. This time around, we have 3 under Finance, Budget, and Personnel. One is to approve a creation of an allowance for doubtful EMS accounts. people have probably heard us talking about the ambulance service. Well, we need to create and maintain an account for how much money we expect to not collect based upon Medicare and Medicaid. We only get so much, and then the rest is not going to be collectible, to be able to track that better. Also, we are approving a resolution to set the new fee schedule for 2023. Every year we update the fee schedule of whether it's you're coming in to get a variance or a conditional use permit. Maybe you're going to the clerk's office, you want to get a bartender's license. All those we review every year to see if they're really covering our costs, and then we update some of them. So that schedule is going forward for approval. And these were all recommended by the Finance, Budget, and Personnel Committee. And then finally, we're going to do a revaluation of all property in the city. And I'm sure you and I will be talking about this more as it gets going. But it's been more than a decade since we've done that to get all the property values to where they belong. And we're taking on forward appraisal to do that work if the council ratifies it.
Right, and with the property review throughout the whole city, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone's taxes are going to go up. No, it's just getting the levels up to where they're supposed to be.
Yeah, a good point, David. It's really about equity. So let's say your house is valued at $200,000 now. When this is over, it might be valued at $225,000, and you start thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to pay that much more taxes. But most of the properties will go up because it's been a number of years. And so, there may be slight winners and slight losers comparatively, but for the most part, it's not about taxation, it's about equity to make sure that we're valuing the properties at what they really are worth.
Right, and that's real important, especially, if the city probably wants to do something later on down the road that could be used for a levy, correct?
Yeah, yep. Correct. It all ties to the annual levy, and the state really mandates that we keep these property values up. We can't ignore it. I mean, we can't just say, well, whatever, it costs money to do this. We'll let the property value for Steve Barg stay at whatever for the rest of his life. That's not reflecting of what the true picture is, and that does involve the tax levy ultimately.
Okay. Well, that's good information. I'm sure there's folks out there that don't know all the ins and outs and why the city has to do something, and sometimes it's not from the city that's regulated from the state that we're forced to do something. So
we have a very good point. We have a lot of mandates from the state and the federal government of things that we do that people wonder, why would the city have to do this? Or why does the city care? In this case, I think we do care because we want equity among property owners, but we have a lot of things we're required to do just because we get direction from the state of Wisconsin.
Okay. Good to know on that. All right, so we're going to get down into the main action items for on Tuesday there.
Okay.
That's going to be next week here, a week of Thanksgiving. So
I know,
yeah,
really flying, isn't it?
I know, isn't it?
Of course, we do have snow now.
I know. Well, they're talking 35, so maybe it might all melt away. Who knows? But
I'll vote for that.
Okay. All right. So we have a second reading ordinance of 1484, which is a certain section in 3-66 for creating a audit committee. Ed Wagner is going to be speaking to that. What is the audit committee all about, and why is it going to be important?
Well, every year, David, the city has an audit, and we've been using Clifton Larson Allen for a while. They do the work. Every year they come in, they sit down with our staff, they do field work, they do a lot of checking of all our finances, and then they give an opinion, and they have all sorts of reports they give in terms of how we're doing. Well, we've had some challenges in the last couple of years. You've heard about that. Back in 2019, there was an issue with the TIF districts. We've had other things come up over recently. The EMS fund has been talked about. So Ed Wagner's vision is to have 3 people who are appointed. They're not members of the council, they're not elected officials, but maybe have some background in finance and whatever, and they're going to be kind of overseeing the audit process. In other words, they're not going to be doing the auditing. They wouldn't be sitting in there going, well, let me see now who paid this bill. What they're going to be doing is making sure that the process is working and that there's somebody on behalf of the council who can certify that, it all seemed like it went well, it seemed like they were doing the things that they were supposed to do, looking for the things they're supposed to look for, so that the audit report is maybe viewed as something that's been looked at prior to the council. This is not a disrespect of the staff. I know that they feel like our finance director and our finance staff do a great job. It's one more layer to make sure that we're protected against anything being out of the ordinary.
Right, and our finance department is doing a wonderful job in finding a lot of things lately, and it's more than it shouldn't be harming somebody's area that they work in. That they feel like, well, maybe I'm not doing my job right. It's just a check and balance to make sure that everything is 100% where it's supposed to be, right?
Yeah, and I've talked to Jennifer Selensky, our finance director, who's doing a great job. And she feels the same way as what you just said. I mean, we feel like we're doing everything we can to work with the auditor so that the reports are accurate and correct and cover all the details. But if to have another group of people to look at it who have some background in finance, can't hurt. I mean, it's something that might be helpful. We'll just see where it goes.
Right. Okay. So next up here, we're going to have the first reading of an ordinance of 1483, which is going to be appointing a board committee to.
Yeah, it's about the appointments of
municipal codes.
Right. And this is becoming a mini series. For those of you who tuned in, you're probably thinking, how many times are they going to talk about how people are appointed to boards and committees? It came up with an appointment about 2 months ago where there was a question about somebody, well, is she a city resident? Well, can you be on if you're not a city resident? The answer today, David, is you can under certain circumstances, but the council would like to broaden those off to include more people. Like maybe you don't live in the city limits, but you own a business in the city limits. So you have a stake in the community. You want to see it be better, and maybe you ought to be on a board and committee, even though you live in Stratford. But there's been a lot of talk, and you've probably covered some of these,
yes,
about who ought to be allowed to be on committees, who's not. So we're refining this. Well, we had a first reading of this ordinance 2 weeks ago, but what came out of it is that if we amend 2.88, we also have to change Chapter 14. So, I've kind of moved it to the point of another first reading because, we want it to be accurate. So if the public looks at our agendas, they know what we're talking about. And the Chapter 14 part about the Utilities Commission is a little bit new. But it's going to be more of the same thing you've heard, nailing down who is appropriate to serve on these bodies to help the city. They do a lot of the legwork in the city. They're the ones who do the groundwork to bring these proposals forward, but just making sure that we have the right candidates is a big thing.
All right, let's get on to the next one here. We're going to have a first ordinance reading of 1480, and the Marshfield Municipal Code, which was presented by the fire department here about bonfires. I know not too long ago there was a incident where someone lit up a bonfire, and here there was fuels that weren't supposed to be in there, and a lot of people got hurt. What is this ordinance? How is that going to affect? Let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, I want to clarify for the people tuned in today. We're not talking about where you go in your backyard, you take out that little thing you bought at Fleet Farm, and you sit around and have a good visit. Those aren't bonfires. We're talking about these bigger events where people have large piles of wood. And it's something that we are concerned about for safety reasons. So the reason for this thing is not to take away people's fun, but it goes back to what you said. We want to know who's in charge, who's the sponsor. Let's see a plan in advance. How big is it going to be? What are you doing in terms of safety to protect if something goes wrong? Get all those things agreed upon and understood and signed off on before you do it. We're not anticipating problems, but like you said, it doesn't take much for someone to use something that they shouldn't be using, to set it up in a place or a way that they shouldn't, and cause problems. I mean, even to nearby structures potentially. So all this is, and I'm not going to read through it, it's out there on the website, is to make sure that these larger bonfires are kept under control for the enjoyment and safety of everyone.
Right, and that's one of the jobs of the fire department, as public safety, is to make sure that not only the people that are operating that bonfire, but to make sure that people and structures and anything around that is safe as well. I mean, we don't need an explosion in town, So
no, and David, I've been in government for a long time, basically my whole adult life, and sometimes even I think, does government have to have so many regulations? Are they trying to keep us from having fun? No, in this case, it's all about safety. We want people to have bonfires and celebrate the things that they do. We just want it to be safe and orderly and nothing to go wrong.
All right. Yes, it would be something good to have in place there, just to make sure to have a second pair of eyes to make sure that everyone's being safe.
Yep,
so.
Agreed.
All right. Next up here, Jennifer Selensky. She's going to request for approve an agreement for financial audit services. I think we already talked a little bit on that.
We talked about the other piece of it. We talked about the oversight of the auditor. This is actually picking the auditor. And we did a request for proposals, and we want to stay with the firm that we use now. It's called CLA, Clifton Larson Allen. We've been with them for a long time. We looked to see if there was anybody better out there, and we're sticking with them. And they come here and do the annual audit, and then come along in the spring, they give a report to the council, answer all sorts of questions. How are our fund balances doing? Are we moving in the right direction or the wrong direction? Is everything accounted for? No missing money, those kind of things. And so what Jennifer is bringing forward is to sign on for another 5 years with CLA to be our auditor. But again, how that plays with the earlier one is that they'll be the auditor doing the work and the report, but there would be the 3 people kind of overlooking the process to make sure that everything's being done appropriately.
Appropriate. Okay. Next up, we'll take both of these items in one. So I guess my question is here. So we have 2 items here for both the shared ride taxi service. One is a contract, and I think we sign a 5-year, but we renew every year within that, just for I think for the state of Wisconsin.
Correct.
And then there's also a lease lease for the shared ride vehicle taxi rides. Yep. Why are these 2 separate? Isn't the taxi service just rolled into one resolution? Or
very good question.
That's
a very good question, David. The contract is with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. We're signing on for another year, and like you said, it's kind of weird because we do an RFP, request for proposals, every 5 years. And so people say, well, if you sign on with running from Viroqua for 5 years, why do you keep having to re-up every year? But the state requires that an annual contract be done, and there might be minor changes to reflect costs and so forth. So that's what that's about. And by the way, for people watching, this will be the 5th and final year next year of this contract with running. So we will be doing another request for proposals in the summer, in the early fall of 2023, looking to see who else might be out there. Is there a better provider or whatever than running? They've done a good job for us. The other one is a lease of vehicles with running. That's where we're actually leasing vehicles from them as part of the operation to do the service. So one contract is with the state, the other is with the provider to actually have access to some of the vehicles that are used.
Okay, good to know. I didn't know that either. I thought that it would be all under one thing. If it's contracted, it's all together. But it's actually two separate items.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I just said that. You're correct, and I just said that wrong. And I knew I said it wrong. Running, the provider leases the vehicles from the city. The city owns the vehicles. Running leases them. I got a little off on that for a second, but that's the way it works. And we buy them through the state. We get grant money to do that.
Okay. Oh, very good. Very interesting there. There's a lot of stuff in government that people don't realize, or I didn't even realize, why something is done the way it is, and all these negotiations and approving of certain things and why the council does it. So
there's a lot to it.
There is. All right. Next up here, we're going to have a proposal on Brayton Park Skate Park to do a little bit of cleanup there. Mike O'Reilly, council member from District 9, he's going to speak on it. Can we talk a little bit about that subject that's going on?
Yeah, there was a terrible incident that most people know about now where a young man died recently. I think it was a drug overdose. And he apparently really liked the skate park, spent a lot of time over there. So a lot of his friends got together and they did some stuff. They painted some things on that honored him, on the walls of the skate park and did some other stuff to make kind of a memorial to him out there. And that was really wonderful. It was part of a vigil and a great testimony to that individual's impact in their lives. But some time passes and our Parks and Recreation staff is saying, well, we can't just leave it like that. We got to do something with it. So the conversation is now what to do with it. And I think what you're going to see discussed, and I think Mike O'Reilly feels this way too, we may be painting over the walls and doing some other stuff to clean up, but is there a way as part of this that there can be some kind of memorial made or left to that individual who was a big fan of the skate park? So I think Mike wants to make sure that if the Parks and Recreation Department cleans it all up, is there a possibility to do something to honor and recognize that person as part of what goes on in 2023.
Right, and it'd be really interesting to see how all that comes to play. I know I was at the Park and Rec meeting last week or the week before there, and they were talking about that and how they want to do that there. So I think that'd be really neat for the community and for those that use that skate park, that there's at least something left.
Yeah, it may be small, I don't know, but something, whatever it is to sort of, again, recognize that individual.
Right. Okay. Next up here, Rebecca Spiros is going to be, or it's going to be introduced by you, but presented by Rebecca here to discuss a possible creation of a grant writer. we got revenue of taxes and stuff coming in, and aid from the state. Do we need a grant writer? I mean,
we need grants.
Grants.
Grants are really helpful. I mean, the state revenue that comes to us is relatively flat. You can only increase taxes so much, and yet there's rising cost. Inflation is up there 7 or 8%. There are a lot of grants out there, David, but the problem is how do you find them? How do you investigate them? We don't have a lot of staff to spend their time all day at their desk reading through federal brochures looking for grants that we might be able to use here in Marshfield. We used to have a grant writer back in 2012 through 2014. And when it was a joint project between the CDA, the school district, and the city, we jointly paid for the person. But when that person left, we kind of looked at each other and thought, well, some of these grants are starting to dry up. Maybe we won't refill that position. Well, fast forward to now, apparently there's more grant opportunities than there used to be. And cities and villages really want to grab onto them because there's a lot of things you'd like to do, but you can't if you can't get part of it paid for by someone else. So Rebecca Spiros, one of our council members, is saying, could we look at that? So all that's really going to happen at the meeting is I'm going to report on what we did back in 2012 and how it worked, and then we'll have some discussion as to whether or not we want to look at trying to create a position like that in the future.
Right, and with everything that's been going on in the recent Common Council budget meetings, every penny almost counts.
Absolutely.
And to have a shortfall on something could be something negatively impacted across somewhere within the departments of city.
Well, and quite frankly, some of the grants that the fire department's gotten lately, they've gotten a couple in recent times, has been very helpful in terms of funding public safety.
Right. So. Yes, it's very well needed. All right.
We're going to continue on public safety.
We're going to public safety, yeah. So you're going to give a presentation on public safety. What is that? And it's a referendum?
Yeah,
possible.
Yeah, I mean, referendum is a word we don't talk about a lot in city government. We had one about 6 years ago to try and raise more money for some bigger street projects. That one failed by a 2-to-1 margin, like 65 to 35%. To try and what you're doing with a referendum is you're asking the taxpayers to allow them to increase their own taxes, at least for some period of time, in order to do something. In this case, it would be for fire and EMS services, fire and ambulance. And I think a lot of people who are tuned in right now know that we've had a struggle in that area. And part of that is because, a big part of it is because Medicare and Medicaid are good programs, but they only pay for a part of those bills. And as a result, we don't get reimbursement for the rest. So it's hard to run a service in a way that meets your financial needs. So we're going to talk a little bit about how other cities across Wisconsin have been doing these public referendums for police and fire and ambulance. And a lot of cities have passed them. 17 cities earlier this month, David, actually passed referendums for people to tax themselves more to help fund police and fire and ambulance services. So we're not going to be trying to get the council to vote that night. We're not going to be saying, hey, look, let's do a referendum, at the next election. But trying to answer some questions, do some basic Q&A to understand what that would mean. What would it look like? How much money could be raised? And those types of things.
Right. And for a referendum to even come to fruition on the table there, how many council members need to vote yes to do that? And that probably requires people going to the polls to vote on that particular issue, right?
I think it just requires a simple majority to set it for a referendum, but then it's up to the public. It's going to be whether the public wants to do this or not. And people generally don't like to raise their own taxes.
Right. And
so I think that if this is ever going to go anywhere, it's going to be with people understanding the real need we have right now. And I think people really respect our fire and ambulance services, and they want to keep them good. They want to keep them quality. They don't want to see them decline. And the purpose will be kind of a way of explaining to people through a public campaign, if we have a referendum, why is this significant? What won't happen? What will be the problems if we don't get additional funding to help with those critical services? So again, right now it's nothing more than a first presentation, and we'll see if the council has interest.
Okay. Yeah, referendums, they could be quite tricky there, so.
Yeah, they are.
So,
usually they're not passed, but in this case lately we've seen a lot of communities pass them for very specifically, not for the whole government, but very specifically for public safety.
Public safety, because public safety without it, it might take a little longer for someone to get to your fire, or if you had to call the ambulance, you don't want a shortfall there. So
we're talking about personnel, equipment, and all those things. And I'm not trying to paint a bad picture for people tuned in right now that we don't have quality people and quality equipment, but it's expensive and we want to make sure that we have the resources to keep it up the way that the people expect.
Sure. And then on this meeting here, we're also going to talk about changing dates there on December at doing it December 20th. Is there any changes to that? It's going to still...
No. Every year we do this because every year that fourth Tuesday falls right around Christmas, and believe it or not, there aren't a lot of council members who want to come to a meeting on December 24th or
No.
December 25th. Come on, how committed are you to your job? You can open your presents later. So we almost always move the second meeting in December from the fourth Tuesday to the third Tuesday. But if you look at the calendar, I've got it in front of me here, you don't, but it's a busy last night that we have. There would be JL, that's Judiciary and License at 5 o'clock, Finance, Budget, and Personnel at 5:30, Council at 6 o'clock, and then Plan Commission at 7 o'clock. So before we go into that 2-week break, when there aren't many meetings, it'll be likely to be a full night here at City Hall.
Yeah, and we've been having some full nights lately the last few weeks here.
Yeah.
Before we close the show here, is there anything else that you would like to bring up there?
I think I'd just like to remind people about the budget public hearing on November 30th. That's when the council will consider, and there have been a lot of changes. The council has been talking about some cuts, and so if you want more information, you can certainly call me at City Hall. Go to our website. I think you'll find the public hearing notice. But if you have any interest in what we're doing in terms of taxing and spending, you have questions, feel free to come. The meeting will begin with a public hearing when anybody who comes can come to the podium with an idea, with questions. That'll be at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, November 30th. I think that's the big thing, David, until we get through that process.
Sure. And this budget meeting, this is going to be the last one where everything's final from your approved, the budget that you presented plus the cuts that
have been
made. So that will be the last one where they rip apart the cuts and the budget and decide
Correct.
This is it.
Correct, and I'm not trying to be funny here, but the council needs to stay there all night if they have to that night, really, because it takes us 2 full weeks to do the tax bills, to get them out. We need to get them out by around the 15th of December. So that night, if they hear the public and they change their minds and they want to cut here and add here, that will be the night that they'll be doing it for the final time.
All right, and I do suggest that if anybody wants to be involved in that process, there's a sign-up sheet when you walk into the council chambers there. If you want to do public speaking, that's your time, and I think you get 5 minutes.
Up to 5 minutes.
Up to 5 minutes to speak. It's not necessarily that they won't respond to what you said, but if it's an emergency action or an item that presents to be brought up in another council meeting, that happens.
Yeah, and this is available at all council meetings. Every council meeting, you can do that, what David just said, and you don't have to have the answer, you don't have the solution. You might just be saying, hey, look, there's a problem in my neighborhood, could somebody look at it? Feel free to bring it up.
Sure. All right. Well, Steve, I think that's the end of that there, and we look forward to your next one there, and it's going to be
what's the date? Yeah.
Close to Christmas there. So.
Well, yeah, a little before that, but we have an extra week this time because we have 5 Tuesdays, so the next regular council meeting won't be till December 13th. So it will be early December before our next program.
Yeah. All right, Steve. Well, thank you so much for coming up here and talking about the meeting that's going to come up here on November 22nd at 6 p.m.
6 p.m. at City Hall.
Yep. So for Council Preview, I'm David Ballerstein along with Steve Barg. Have a great day.